welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I'm joined by Kristof Smeyers, Research Fellow at the University of Leuven and author of the book Supernatural Bodies, which was published recently. Welcome to the podcast, Kristof, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Robin. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, your book is about stigmatics in Britain and Ireland, isn't it? So let's start with the basics. Could you sketch out who stigmatics are and what the stigmata are?
So, in its purest theological form, stigmata are the wounds of Christ when he is crucified. So they are the wounds of the nails going through the hands, the palms of the hands or the wrists. That's also a topic of discussion. Through the feet, there's the side wound when the spear reaches for his ribs, I think. And in some cases, we're also including the pinpricks of the crown of thorns as it was placed on his head. So those are stigmata. They're very closely associated with Christ's body. And in the 13th century, the so-called first stigmatic is St. Francis of Assisi, who in 1224 receives these wounds from cherub or from a vision. And that sets off something of a devotional revolution in some ways, in that more and more people from the 13th century on are claiming to have Christ's wounds on their own bodies. And that's what we tend to call stigmatics. So people who partake in Christ's passion by showing or feeling, at least, it's not always visible, the same wounds that Christ had when he was crucified. It's something it's a phenomenon that's very often associated with a very particular type of medieval Catholic or Christian devotion. But several historians have now pointed out, and which is also what my book is trying to build on, is that the phenomenon an sich as a phenomenon becomes something different in the 19th century, and arguably becomes something much more public and much more, I want to say popular, but it's a very controversial phenomenon, at least, that plays into the public sphere.
Yeah, and I imagine that listeners who have heard of the stigmata before will associate them with the wounds of Christ. But one thing that comes through from your book is that the definition can be broader, can't it?
Well, that's something that I wasn't prepared for when I came across it in so many sources. So we're also talking about very elaborate Christian imagery that appears on people's backs or chests, words, for example, or IHS, Jesus' name. And all these different types of bodily marks or scratch marks sometimes also are referred to as stigmata by contemporaries, and are sometimes also treated as such, as if they were signs from Christ or from God. So they spark devotion. So I've included those as well. Yes.
Yeah. And so the definition of stigmata can go beyond the wounds of Christ, and likewise, the circles in which they're found can clearly go beyond the Catholic circles that they originated in, the likes of St. Francis, even though we tend to think of stigmata as being a Catholic thing.
Historians have always treated it as a Catholic thing, and have looked for it in predominantly Catholic countries, which makes sense in some ways. So my book is actually one sequel to a larger research project that was looking at stigmata in continental Europe or Western Europe. And those are the countries that you would expect are the usual suspects to go looking for this type of thing. So Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. And that research has confirmed that it is very much a Catholic phenomenon. So I was wondering what would happen if you went looking for something like this in a place that is less obvious. So I went looking for stigmata in Britain. I think that was a very naive start of my research, and what I found was so many non-Catholic stigmatics, people who bore the wounds. A huge variety of people, and also a huge variety in the meanings that were then given to those stigmata.
And not only were the stigmata incongruous, perhaps, to our eyes in a Protestant society, they were also incongruous, weren't they, given that in the 19th century they were being observed against the background of a modern or modernizing society.
That's what makes it so interesting that these phenomena became such topics of discussion in the 19th century, when you see an increasing importance of the value of eyewitnessing and empirical evidence when establishing whether something is supernatural or natural, or even the act of defining what is supernatural and what isn't becomes so loaded with or charged with all types of heated opinions that something like a stigmata, someone whose body is moving through society, showing things that shouldn't be possible, draws attention from across society, you could say. So you have natural scientists who become interested, but also Catholic doctors, for example, or anti-Catholic groups, or Catholic traditionalists, or just people who have an opinion and feel the need and also have the opportunity to voice it increasingly as the 19th century public sphere expands so rapidly.
Indeed, indeed. Well, let's take as a convenient starting point what happened in 1838, because this is when this radical prophet, John Thom, reveals himself as a stigmatic, isn't it? This is your first major case of 19th century stigmata in Britain.
Yeah, it's immediately one of the most exotic or eccentric cases of stigmata that we as a team have come across for the whole of Europe, for the whole of the 19th and the 20th centuries, because he's a man who has often been described by historians as suffering from extreme mental disorders. He's been incarcerated as well in one of the first asylums of the country in Kent, because he claimed to have a bunch of identities. And he presented himself also as the long-lost William Courtney, who had returned from journeys in Israel. So he had all these grand stories with which he presented himself in Canterbury in the 1830s, and he also ran for elections. He got a surprising number of votes, actually, on quite a radical... it's sometimes been described as a proto-communist program, and he had extreme rhetorical talents. So when he came out of the asylum in 1837, he found a new persona in some ways. He had gone religious, you could say, and he now presented himself as Christ reborn. And he was actually 2,000 years old. He'd come off a cloud, and he needed something physical and visible to prove that with. So suddenly he had stigmata. And across Kent, or at least in the towns around Canterbury, I found a lot of evidence of people believing this. So they followed him precisely because he claimed to be Christ reborn, and they thought of him as the Messiah, and the Messiah promised imminent revolution and judgment. So he gathered mostly farmhands around him, weaponized or armed them, did a bunch of rituals, and set off for Canterbury to start not glorious, quite a bloody revolution, actually, and was stopped by the army and was killed in the woods. And he did not return from the dead, unfortunately, even though a lot of his followers were expecting it for the next 3 days. And it's one of the reasons why he was buried in secret. And yes, it was a bit of upheaval in Canterbury in the following weeks. And he's the first, chronologically at least in the 19th century, the first case I've found which at least gets enough public attention or is controversial enough or necessitate some type of action. He becomes a public figure, and a very problematic public figure. And also after his death, considerable effort is made by the authorities, both clerical and the local authorities, to disenchant him, you could say, to say that those wounds were not stigmata, but they were actually the wounds that he got from the battle in which he died. There's a lot of focus on his body on the one hand as something that is not in any way touched by God, and his mind, which was ill, I suppose. And those two things have been picked up by historians. But at the loss of this local devotional group, you could say. So those sources are still there, but they've not been treated seriously before. And they do talk of very sincerely held beliefs in the fact that the Messiah was now in Kent. Yeah, it was interesting to see how he used stigmata as something that was really drawing people to him. There was a lot of direct visceral potential there.
And was Tom totally sincere? Is there any suggestion that he was faking it in order to gain money or notoriety?
That's difficult to say. I mean, he did have a reputation by the time he showed his stigmata. He had a reputation of faking identities, which doesn't speak for him, I would say. The fact also that at the post-mortem investigations and examinations of his body, there were no wounds reported to show on his hands and feet doesn't sound too promising. But I've found no evidence that he faked his wounds. No. But I also think it wasn't in anyone's interest in those final months of his life to go look for reasons to disprove them. His opponents were too busy trying to curtail the social damage that he could do, I think, in Canterbury, to figure out whether his wounds were real or not.
So was he seen by his opponents mainly as a religious fanatic or as a political revolutionary?
As a political madman, I think. Yeah. Because when he ran in the local elections in 1832, he did so much better than his opponents were expecting. That became the focus point. So his political program was the thing that they were attacking the most. And the fact that he'd been incarcerated in an asylum was very handy for them, because it meant that they could discredit him completely as a serious political figure in local politics, which I think he realized quite quickly, and therefore reframed or redirected his public persona into something more explicitly religious and prophetic. It's also when he starts identifying with predecessors like Richard Brothers, and he starts saying that he was deeply involved in these local radical circles in London, which again, I found no evidence of any of this. He was someone who's very good at telling stories.
Yeah, mention of Richard Brothers raises the point that he wasn't the first. John Tom wasn't the first religious prophet to arise in Britain in this period. There had been Richard Brothers a few decades before. There had also been Joanna Southcott, but they hadn't been stigmatics or hadn't claimed to be stigmatics. Joanna Southcott famously had a phantom pregnancy, but the stigmatic element of this was new in 1838, wasn't it, to John Tom?
As far as I can trace it, he's really brought it into the country, or reinvented it at least in the country. There were some stigmatics in England in the early modern period. They were religious, obviously, or very often women religious or men religious who were confined to the convent or the monastery they lived in and didn't cause too much of a fuss. So in another way, he's a trendsetter in that he brought it out. He was a lay person, which in itself is something that you can notice as a broader shift for the phenomenon. So there's a gradual shift from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, where the phenomenon becomes more and more, or it manifests more frequently on lay people rather than nuns or monks or brothers.
And he was a Protestant, of course, which adds a further dimension to the case. Although it's in this period, isn't it, that Catholic devotions start breaking through into British or English religiosity, because you get the Oxford movement coming along in the 1830s with those who are favouring a more Catholic approach to religion and the backlash that springs up to that. So was Tom part of that?
Interestingly not, no. But I do think the chronology is significant in that way. It does seem like something was hanging in the air, because very soon after John Tom's controversy dies out, other stigmatics start appearing who have nothing to do with John Tom as such, but do appear in that context of post-Catholic emancipation devotions appearing, and you see this whole rhetoric of anti-Catholicism as well, and then the Oxford movement who tries to figure out what to do actually with something like stigmata, which has the potential of being quite explosive. But yeah, John Tom was a Protestant, though he professed not to believe in God at some point in his life. So there's some personal shifts going on in how he sees the world and the universe as well. So I'm not sure how he personally fitted his own stigmata in his personal belief system. That remains unclear. But there are no Catholic movements or devotional movements trying to claim him, for example, nor is there any anti-Catholic rhetoric surrounding him. It feels like he's too, even at the time, he was too eccentric to really engage with. Local religious authorities also did not really talk about the stigmata, for example, or about his Christ-like persona, but talked more about how he upset the social order.
Yeah, and you can understand perhaps why the Catholic Church in England wouldn't want to touch a case like this and wouldn't want to touch a guy like him. But I believe there was also a controversy, wasn't there, which inflamed anti-Catholic sentiments about cases or alleged cases of stigmata in Austria.
And that's very soon after the whole John Tom case. Actually, already from 1834, 1835, British visitors started going to Austria and to Italy, and it's part of a kind of Catholic grand tour almost, where they venture into these tiny mountain villages in the Alps, and to their surprise, find sometimes only 10 miles apart from each other, young women lying in their beds, suffering from the wounds of Christ every week, usually on a Friday afternoon. And those women are already locally known for being type of mystic, also as a kind of devotional side of pilgrimage almost. So people go into the bedrooms to pray and to ask for intercessions. And that local dynamic grows into something international very quickly, especially when you get some very high-profile British Catholics going to the Alps and seeing these women bleed in person. They write about it, also because they feel it is because these women in what they describe as a very pure, untouched Catholic landscape. It's a rugged mountain landscape. It's difficult to get to these houses. They're very isolated, and the idea is conjured up, at least, that it's a type of Catholicism that is untouched by modernity or by everything else that has contaminated it in other places. And these women are manifestations of something really pure, Christ himself. And as such, they become also, to some Catholics at least, in Britain and Ireland, some kind of symbol for Catholic rejuvenation in the British Isles after emancipation. So the Earl of Shrewsbury, who goes to the Alps in 1841, probably the most influential one of these visitors, because he writes a short pamphlet about what he sees, and that pamphlet has an enormous readership across the British Isles, almost immediately upon publication. And it actually triggers a whole series of people who trace Shrewsbury's footsteps and go do the same route in the Alps. But like you mentioned, it also triggers violent anti-Catholic responses, because also these women that Shrewsbury talks about, and images start circulating about them, of them in Britain. They embody everything that is wrong with Catholicism to people outside of it. So it's the focus on the body, and it's a bit the blood and the potentially malignant role of local clergy in trying to orchestrate these, what they call performances, to convince credulous visitors. That type of language quickly pervades the whole situation. And that goes on throughout the 1840s in Britain. What they call the Shrewsbury controversy keeps making people angry, basically. But it also triggers, that properly introduces the phenomenon in Catholic devotional circles in Britain.
So the Austrian cases could be accounted for within existing discourses of Catholic piety and anti-Catholicism, and someone like John Tom can be dismissed as a madman. But these cases keep coming along, don't they? And there are cases that can't be accommodated in that way. And one set of cases which can be brought up in this context comes from the 1859 Ulster Revival, Could you talk about what role Stigmata played in that episode?
So it's the Presbyterian revival in Ulster in 1859, the autumn of 1859, and goes into 1860. It's often been described as a type of fever or a wildfire of conversion momentum. And very quickly, from the autumn of 1859, actually, people start having all types of so-called physical prostrations, which is often, most often, it's a type of convulsions and ecstasies and trances that then lead to personal conversion and mass conversion to Presbyterianism. But a significant slice of those physical prostrations are called stigmata. And throughout Belfast and the outskirts of Belfast, and also in the countryside, you start seeing people flock to individuals who bleed from their bodies in all types of unusual ways and say that they have been graced by God because they have been converted and have now taken on a role of embodying that conversion momentum, basically embodying the revival itself. And there are stories of streets in Belfast clotting up with devotees and pilgrims wanting to see women who have the word Jesus written on their forearms in the hopes of being converted, of being convinced of the fact that Presbyterianism is the way forward. But also because they are such public figures, they become such public figures and also such problematic public figures in very many cases. Some of them charge money, for example, to come into the house. They attract attention of people who want to, of critics of the revival. So they become these almost symbolic things for pro and anti-revivalists. And because of that controversy, they actually get more and more attention. So you can see that local authorities and the revivalists themselves at some point get a little bit embarrassed with the attention that goes to them rather than to the ideas of the revival. They become detractors of it. But again, it's a bit similar to what is happening in the Alps, you could say, in that what is really at stake or what is at the center of the whole issue is the visibility of something strange on someone's body. And people can't account for it, and people want to see it in person. People often want to touch it as well, or take home some type of relic, because it's something so viscerally there, and you can get up close to it. And therefore, it's a different type of religious experience, you could say, than sitting in church or even watching someone go through convulsions. You can really take some of the blood home with you.
There's an interesting point here, isn't there, which is that stigmata provide a means of cutting out the church and the clerical hierarchy from religious experience. So an individual who's received the stigmata or claims to have received them is claiming a direct line to God or to Christ. And presumably that's something that antagonizes vested interests, whether that's in the Catholic Church or among Ulster Presbyterians.
That's, I think, one of the core issues of mystics who enter the public eye and show the stigmata is indeed exactly that. They become alternative ways of experiencing true religion for many people. And that's also why the church doesn't really know what to do with stigmata throughout the 19th or the early 20th century. It's definitely not considered a miracle, for example, by the Vatican at any point. It is not considered a reason to canonize or sanctify someone. Quite the opposite. So very often the church sends a committee over to kind of silence the whole thing. Because you don't want a mystic, especially not in a place like the Alps or in most of England after emancipation, to grow into some type of public representative of God on earth. So the church takes a very critical stance to the whole thing, and to most cases, and that doesn't actually change till Pope Jean Paul II, who had a personal relationship with Padre Pio, I think, and therefore you can see a shift from the 1980s or so towards a more accepted stance towards the phenomenon, I'd say. Also, the church is very involved in trying to debunk cases throughout the period. So to show that this is actually something that is done through self-harm or because of mental illness or because someone else, a rogue priest, for example, is trying to assert some type of authority by inflicting stigmata on someone in their parish.
Cardinal Newman made that suggestion, didn't he? He suggested that some nuns who claimed to have the stigmata may have inflicted the wounds on themselves.
Yeah, and there are cases where that does seem to be the case, yes. Something that was mentioned in quite a few newspapers in England in the 1880s was a Sicilian Jesuit who went to Malta, which was still British territory at the time, to train. And they found a bucket of chicken blood behind the door with which he put on himself to claim that he was stigmatized every Friday.
God.
And those cases were smeared out also by the Catholic hierarchy to show that this phenomenon shouldn't be trusted.
And more recently, one of the Palmarian popes in Spain, in fact, I think it was the first one, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He claimed to be a stigmatic, and I think was seen by journalists to be cutting himself to produce the wounds.
There are, even with Padre Pio, and I have to be careful what I say, but it's not clear how he was stigmatized. There are sources that say that he kept his wounds open with a type of acid, for example. There is also the issue of timing, I suppose. Some people are stigmatized once in their lives. Other people have it almost throughout their lives and are actually effectively bedridden because of it, because of blood loss, for example. Other people don't bleed all that much. So it affects individuals in different ways, you could say. The impact it has on people's lives is different from case to case. The young women in the Alps, they could not leave their beds. Whereas someone like John Tom was allegedly lifting beer barrels above his head with his stigmatized hands, and
really
some type of supernatural strength. Yes.
God. Well, if we remain with the 19th century cases, but move forward a little bit in time, Marianne Gerling was another British Protestant stigmatic, wasn't she?
She was a Methodist preacher in the 1860s. Whose style of preaching became unappealing to other Methodists because she was very, how shall I say it, very aggressive in her preaching. So they cast her out, but she continued to preach ad hoc, you could say. But she also fell ill in 1864, I believe, and was bedridden and had a visit of the Holy Dove, who stigmatized her. After that, she became a kind of cult leader, you could say, like your typical Victorian cult leader, in that she attracted at most 200 or 300 people around her, shunned and ridiculed wherever she went, and eventually retreated into the New Forest, where she did she made a makeshift camp, I suppose, with her followers, and in very nasty conditions, you could say, tried to survive and keep her community together. And she had the stigmata, but she didn't really talk about it much until the very last stage of her life, when her community was already unraveling. You could almost see it as an escalation of trying to assert some type of spiritual authority, if you want to look at it in a functionalist way. So she saw that people were leaving, also that our families were trying to rescue people who were in the cult, and she reacted by becoming a much more visibly blessed person. So she suddenly, before that she wore shoes and gloves, now suddenly she went barefoot, showed her hands, and left her tent bleeding from her wounds freely.
So this is again the stigmata as a source of religious authority, which is distinct from the institutional church and also distinct from the medical establishment. Because while all this is going on, you have doctors, don't you, who, in a typical Victorian way, are weighing into the issue.
Yes, one of the contemporaries of Marianne Gerling was someone you could call a prototypical stigmatic in England, which was a Catholic school teacher, Teresa Higginson, in the Liverpool area. And she was continuously prodded and poked by doctors throughout her life to try and figure out what exactly was causing her frequent bleeding. So yes, there is that medical interest, and Catholic doctors are actually going on public lecturing tours from the late 19th century on to educate, I guess, their audiences about how to approach a phenomenon like this. What do you do when you come eye to eye with a stigmatic? What to look out for? But with Marianne Gerling, she was never medically examined, and I think that's something that she wouldn't have approved of anyway. She ruled her community with an iron fist, and she was also very savvy in playing or appearing in the public sphere and creating a kind of persona. She's a child of her time, yes. So a lot of people claimed that she was a spiritualist, for example. I think at some point she was embroiled in some kind of rivalry with a local mesmerist in the New Forest who were battling it out, I guess, as far as authority goes, because she could, during her services and her preaching, she would be able to almost control the bodies of her followers. So they started dancing wildly and convulsing as well and going into trances, which local mesmerists weren't too pleased about.
So there's competition among these esoteric fringe religious groups.
It was a busy time to be a mystic, I think. Yes. Before she moves to the New Forest, she sets up a shop, I suppose, or a chapel, I should say, in London. And the competition is so fierce that her windows are thrown in. She gets bullied and harassed to the point of leaving. To the point that she receives a prophecy that she has to go to the New Forest.
Yes, this stuff has the potential to whip up people's feelings and to sometimes bring out the uglier side of human nature. But moving forward to the 20th century, we've mentioned medical professionals, that there are other intellectuals, aren't there, who get involved in this area. Herbert Thurston being one such intellectual on the Catholic side.
Thurston is probably one of the most, or is someone I've relied on a lot for writing this book, because very often when I thought I had a new angle to approach it with, I went to Thurston's archives and found that he'd been there before. So I'm thankful and a bit annoyed with him for doing that. But he had an interest in all types of paranormal things. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research as well, corresponded with people like Harry Price, also gave public lectures about stigmata and related phenomena, what he called physical phenomena of mysticism, which included also prolonged bouts of fasting, for example, or ecstasies. He was quite rigorous, but also historic. He's a historian in many ways as well. So he approached the phenomenon from a historical point of view, going back to St. Francis, back to the roots, and trying to figure out what was going on in each case and to see if you could systematically deal with this phenomenon at all, or if you should approach it from a case-to-case basis. He didn't come to a definitive conclusion, but he also didn't rule out the fact that, or the possibility of supernatural interference altogether. He was significant in that he kept an open mind about it, which was very interesting to read because he also corresponded a lot with Catholic doctors who were much more critical of the phenomenon. Francis Walsh, who was a neurosurgeon in London, Letitia Fairfield, all these people who took to the public sphere and took to the newspapers as well to write about how dangerous a phenomenon like stigmata could be, not just for the person involved, not for the damage it does to a person's body and mind, but also to their communities. But then again, for all the work someone like Thurston did, I have only got evidence that he has seen the phenomenon himself just once in Leeds when he was invited to go see it. And after that, he never responded to invitations of a similar kind again. So I don't think he felt the urge to see stigmata in person.
Yeah, he's an interesting character, isn't he? Because he was, in one sense, on the relatively rationalist side of Catholicism. He was against Montague Summers, for example, and his medieval belief in demons and witchcraft. But evidently he was also more inclined or slightly more open to supernatural explanations for these things than some other Catholics.
You see it not just with stigmata, but also with how he studied contemporary movements of theosophy, for example, or how he looked at spiritualism. He was very critical of how it could derail, but I think he also kept an open mind about trying to figure out what was at the core of the matter. What spiritual message were they trying to sell or to deliver, and how sincere was it? But yeah, he didn't like Montague Summers, no, who was also very interested in stigmata for a different reason. There is a note, Jan Michielsen showed it to me, of Montague Summers asking his publisher if he could please write a whole book on stigmata, and the publisher just writing no in very big letters. Summers is actually, you could contextualize him for as far as stigmata go in a movement that was almost a reaction to the naturalization of stigmata. They wanted to recharge it with the supernatural meaning. I think he says it as much. He says it quite explicitly, Summers, that he wants to re-supernaturalize stigmata. Because there is also the sense that, especially once you get to the 20th century, that something has been lost by trying to find explanations or medical explanations for the phenomenon. That the spiritual has gone and you need to find it again.
Yes. That disenchantment was also something that was characteristic of the late 20th century, wasn't it? The Catholic Church loses interest in such things after the Second Vatican Council, although I take your point about John Paul II and Padre Pio. But neither the Church nor wider society seems to have much use for such things, except maybe as curiosities.
Yes, it becomes a bit of a tabloids thing in many cases, but that's also because of there's a diffusion of types of people who have stigmata, and some of them really more explicitly than what I could trace in the sources for this book, try to sell it. As in the 1970s, you have a woman from northern England who really sells her pictures to the Daily Mail, for example, and she poses with her hands, and it's monetized very quickly. But that is not to say that this 19th century type of mystic, someone like John Thom or Mary Ann Gerling, they still exist, but the church stays well clear of them, like they have in the past. Yes, I think there's someone in Croatia at the moment who is a stigmatic, who has a large devotional following. So I'm curious to see what the church will do eventually, because there comes a point where they become so big and so popular that some type of action is required.
Yes, and that brings us on to what was going to be my last question, which is how this phenomenon manifests itself today. Because it's not something which is prominent in public discourse. It's not something you tend to find in the secular media, or for that matter, in the Catholic media or Protestant media. But clearly these cases are still occurring for whatever reason that might be, or whatever combination of reasons. Is this a phenomenon which is always going to be going on, even if it's under the radar and isn't culturally salient, as it might have been 150 years ago?
That's a very good question, and that's the question I'm struggling with as well. When I talk to people about this, especially here on the continent, but also in places in Ireland, less so in Britain, people very quickly point out that when they were a child, they were taken up the road by their grandmother, where they were shown a lady who sat in her chair and bled from the wounds of Christ. So it's definitely something that still went on in the second half of the 20th century, and it hasn't disappeared, but it has gone under the radar. But I don't see any reason why it wouldn't pop up again in the public sphere more prominently at some point in the future. No, it's a very volatile thing. So if some circumstances are going in the right direction or are combined in a new way, and I think that's what I try to show in my book as well, when there are some cultural dynamics happening at the same time, suddenly it becomes relevant, even if it's not salient, but relevant to talk about and to pick up. And I think that's something that could happen again. Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of this conversation, and thank you very much for expounding on this extremely interesting and rather obscure subject. It's quite fascinating, and it's something that deserves more attention and more research. Are you intending to take your current research further, or are you drawing a line under stigmatics for the time being?
I've moved into a demonic possession for now, but I might return to it at some point, yes.
Well, best of luck with the demons anyway.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. Kristof Smeyers, we wish you all the best in your future research and your future endeavours in demonology and any other areas that you venture into. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.